In a striking interview that's already stirring debate, Belarus's self-proclaimed President Alexander Lukashenko claims the fate of peace in Ukraine now rests largely in the hands of Donald Trump and the United States, while urging European leaders to stay out of the process. Speaking to Newsmax, Lukashenko portrays Washington as the decisive power broker, questions Europe's ability to act independently, and issues stark warnings about escalation, Russia's limits, and Ukraine's future. At the core of Alexander Lukashenko's interview with Newsmax is a blunt and carefully framed message. In his view, the road to peace in Ukraine does not run through Brussels, Paris, or Berlin, but through Washington, and more specifically, through President Donald Trump. Lukashenko argues that the decisive variable is not diplomacy in the abstract, but the consistency and resolve of the U.S. president. According to him, if Trump maintains a firm line and does not retreat from his stated position, concrete results will follow. This framing immediately sidelines European governments, which Lukashenko dismisses as actors who have no reason to make noise in the peace process. Such language is not accidental. It reflects a worldview in which power politics outweigh multilateral consensus, and where Europe is portrayed as strategically dependent rather than autonomous. Lukashenko's characterization of Trump is equally revealing. He describes the U.S. president as strong-willed, decisive, and at times impulsive, traits that Lukashenko presents not as flaws, but as assets in ending the war. From his perspective, it is precisely this willingness to push forward aggressively that could force movement toward a settlement. This assessment aligns with Lukashenko's long-standing preference for leader-to-leader bargaining over institutional diplomacy. By emphasizing Trump's personal role, Lukashenko implicitly argues that peace will not come from prolonged negotiations or European-led initiatives, but from pressure applied decisively by the United States at the highest political level. At the same time, Lukashenko's comments serve a strategic purpose beyond simple analysis. By elevating Washington's role and diminishing Europe's, he reinforces a narrative favorable to both Minsk and Moscow, that European leaders lack the financial, military, and political resources to sustain Ukraine without U.S. backing. He explicitly claims that European countries cannot meaningfully support Ukraine on their own, suggesting that their influence collapses the moment Washington steps back or changes course. This argument seeks to normalize the idea that Europe is not a true independent pole in this conflict, but rather an extension of U.S. policy, a claim that resonates strongly in Russian and Belarusian official discourse. Lukashenko's framing is both cynical and calculated. On one hand, it acknowledges a real structural reality: U.S. military aid, intelligence sharing, and financial support have been central to Ukraine's ability to resist Russia. On the other hand, it deliberately erases the political agency of European states and institutions, many of which have taken significant economic and security risks since the war began. By doing so, Lukashenko is not merely analyzing the conflict, he is attempting to shape perceptions of who matters and who does not as discussions about a potential peace plan gain momentum. He claims that U.S. pressure in the peace process is aimed primarily at President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, not at the Kremlin. This assertion is critical because it reflects a narrative long promoted by Moscow and Minsk that Ukraine is the more flexible and ultimately more vulnerable side in the conflict. According to Lukashenko, Washington holds decisive leverage over Kyiv through military aid, financial assistance, and political backing, making the Ukrainian leadership the main target of any push toward compromise. Lukashenko reinforces this claim by warning about the consequences of continued escalation. He argues that a further widening of the war would be strategically disadvantageous for Russia, as it would draw even more people and resources into the conflict. On the surface, this may sound like an unusually cautious assessment coming from one of Moscow's closest allies. However, the subtext is clear: Russia, in Lukashenko's framing, is not interested in endless escalation, but in freezing or concluding the conflict under conditions it can manage. This allows him to present Russia as a rational actor constrained by practical limits, while subtly shifting responsibility for prolonging the war onto Ukraine and its Western backers. The most controversial element of Lukashenko's remarks comes in his comments about Ukraine's future. He claims that President Zelenskyy understands, and must understand, that if the conflict continues on its current path, it could end with Ukraine ceasing to exist as a state. This is not merely a prediction, it is a political warning designed to amplify fear and urgency. By framing the choice as peace now or national destruction later, Lukashenko echoes one of the most extreme talking points used by Russian officials since the early stages of the invasion. It reduces a complex war, shaped by sovereignty, international law, and security guarantees, into a stark ultimatum aimed squarely at Kyiv. While it is true that prolonged war carries enormous risks for Ukraine, demographic losses, economic damage, and long-term instability, the claim that Ukraine's very existence hinges solely on accepting a U.S.-driven peace plan ignores Ukraine's agency and resilience. It also conveniently omits the central cause of the war, Russia's decision to launch and sustain its invasion. Lukashenko's narrative reframes the conflict as an unfortunate but inevitable process that Ukraine must adapt to, rather than a violation that must be resolved on Ukraine's terms. Lukashenko's warnings function as psychological pressure. They are aimed not only at Ukrainian leadership, but also at Western audiences increasingly fatigued by the war. By suggesting that peace is both inevitable and urgently necessary, and that delay only increases the risk of catastrophe, he attempts to make compromise appear not just reasonable, but morally responsible. Alexander Lukashenko presents himself as an advocate of inevitability and pragmatism, repeatedly stressing that all wars eventually end in peace and that the sooner this happens, the fewer lives will be lost. On the surface, this statement appears self-evident and even humane. Yet within the broader context of his interview, it functions as a rhetorical tool designed to normalize the idea of an early settlement on terms shaped primarily by Washington and, indirectly, by Moscow. Lukashenko has long claimed that the war in Ukraine could end in the near future, and once again he insists that Kyiv will ultimately agree to the peace plan proposed by the United States. This confidence is striking, not because peace is impossible, but because it assumes Ukraine's acceptance as a foregone conclusion rather than the outcome of genuine negotiation. Lukashenko further strengthens this narrative by returning to the theme of European weakness. He argues that European leaders lack sufficient resources to support Ukraine without Washington's involvement, reinforcing his earlier dismissal of Europe as a meaningful independent actor. In his view, once the United States applies pressure, European resistance, or support for continued fighting, will quickly fade. This argument reflects a broader geopolitical calculation. If Europe is seen as incapable of acting alone, then any peace framework negotiated under U.S. leadership becomes the only realistic option. Such framing subtly delegitimizes alternative diplomatic paths, including those that might prioritize Ukraine's security guarantees or accountability for Russian actions. Equally revealing are Lukashenko's comments about his own perceived role in this process. He references earlier statements from representatives of Trump's team who claimed that Lukashenko provides the United States with good advice on ending the war, advice that the White House allegedly listens to. By highlighting this, Lukashenko is not merely relaying information, he is actively elevating his status as an informal intermediary or experienced regional voice. His more recent unsolicited advice to President Zelenskyy regarding a peace plan further underscores this ambition. For a leader whose legitimacy is widely contested internationally, positioning himself as a relevant counselor in one of the world's most consequential conflicts serves both personal and political interests. From a critical standpoint, Lukashenko's optimism about peace should be understood less as foresight and more as strategic messaging. His repeated insistence that peace is close and inevitable helps shape expectations, especially among audiences in the United States and Europe who may be growing weary of the war's costs. By framing compromise as unavoidable and delay as reckless, he attempts to narrow the range of acceptable policy choices. The danger of such framing lies in its simplicity. It reduces a complex conflict involving sovereignty, international law, and long-term security architecture into a matter of timing and pressure. His vision of peace is not neutral, it is structured around power hierarchies, with the United States at the top, Europe marginalized, Ukraine pressured, and Russia implicitly normalized as a negotiating partner rather than an aggressor. Whether or not peace emerges in the near future, Lukashenko's remarks offer a clear insight into how authoritarian allies of Moscow seek to influence the narrative by presenting themselves as realists, warning of catastrophe, and insisting that history itself is on their side.